Good afternoon and welcome back to Give the People What They Want. I'm Zoe Alexandra, editor of People's Dispatch, and I'm very happy to be joined, as always, by amazing co-host Roger McKenzie, the international editor of Morning Star, and Prasanth R, who's an Indian journalist. We're back this week with a lot of positive stories, so hopefully we'll shift the tone a little bit. Of course, always with the contradictions, but some really exciting stuff. So we're very excited to get into it. Stay tuned.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Well, July 26th is a very important date for revolutionaries across the world. And a couple years ago, it got an added significance. Prasanth, tell us what July 6th means for people of the world and why it's important in the Sahel.
Right, of course, Zoe, July 26th, the anniversary of the attack on the Moncada barracks in Cuba, a very important moment for all of us who follow our revolutionary histories. It's the starting point, in some senses, of the Cuban Revolution. The attack itself did not necessarily succeed, but it laid the foundations. It actually created the revolutionaries. It helped build that organization, and that's why I think across the world it's always been such a historic date. So really a very good day to remember that process, and not just remember it, but also support it, because the Cuban Revolution is a process that's continuing to this day, resisting against very difficult odds, resisting against the might of the United States and its allies, despite all the sanctions, despite all the multiple attempts at suppressing Cuba. Cuba has endured, it has thrived, it has fought back, and that's really an amazing it's one of the great achievements of humankind, I would say. And just a few years ago, on that exact same date, we saw something happening in Niger as well. Again, a starting point to something very interesting. July 26 marks the anniversary of July 26 marks the day on which the coup against Mohamed Bazoum took place in Niger, and a new government came to power, led by the Council for the Safeguarding of the Homeland, of the CNSP, which has been in power for 2 years now. It's a very interesting moment. Now we can go back to a bit of history. We know that Bazoum was clearly considered to be a puppet of the French, extremely unpopular. The military coup in Niger was actually quite similar to instances in Mali and Burkina Faso, where there was some kind of a convergence between the actions of military officers and mass movements on the ground. We know that Niger, for instance, witnessed continuous and sustained mobilizing of women's movements, of youth movements, students, people across all walks of life who were extremely unhappy with the French, mobilizing around the slogan of France Go Back. And the idea of France Get Out is basically not just that French military troops should withdraw, which the Nigerian government did after July 26. It was one of its first actions, but also the fact that the economic, political, social model based on dependency on France should be reversed, should be completely abolished. And that was the driving force behind those movements which gathered together around that time for many years before, but really culminated on July 26, 2023. And the CNSP government so far has been able to, I think, really work with those movements and in some sense, act as a good symbol and representative of that push in many ways. For instance, we know the fact that I talked about, of course, French forces being expelled. The US was forced to close its base in Agadez, the largest drone base in the world. We know that public monuments, public spaces named after French historical figures were renamed based on people from Niger, from other Pan-African heroes. A similar process has also taken place in Burkina Faso and Mali, for instance. We know that these three countries came together, withdrew from the ECOWAS despite the sanctions ECOWAS had imposed on it. They have been trying to set up their own infrastructure, their own institutions. They set up a criminal court recently, a court of human rights, their own passports, their own national anthem. They're trying to sort of develop joint security cooperation to fight the Islamist forces, which are a considerable threat in that region and whose origins lie in the NATO attack on Libya and the deposition of Muammar Gaddafi. So these governments have been trying very interesting things in that region. And it's very important to note that this is really a very good starting point, and we're extremely popular in that region. We talked about Burkina Faso in the past, where there's been this rising youth sentiment, and where there's a large amount of popularity for its leaders as well. And what we're seeing right now, I think, is a very is a very key moment in the Sahel, in Africa as a whole, because the Sahel is giving, despite these countries actually suffering from a lot of poverty, they're rich in resources, but these resources have been long used to supply the needs of the global North countries. So despite that, they are trying to achieve both political and economic sovereignty, and very, very tough situation right now. But Niger has managed, I think, in 2024 to achieve around 8% growth, which itself is pretty impressive, but it has to be continued. Lot of challenges left. Nobody's denying that. But the fact that these countries are able to actually set out on a model is very, very inspiring at this point, when we seem to face this paucity or of models. People are looking around and saying, how does the world, how do countries organize, or how do you organize societies? So this looks like a very interesting way to challenge imperialism, and the people of the Sahel are very much in the middle of it. So definitely urge you to follow Niger and follow the coverage on People's Dispatch and Morning Star, where a lot of these developments are not only reported on, but actually placed in context as well.
And to that, Prasanth, I'd add another date for the revolutionary calendar, which is September 16th, the founding of the Alliance of Sahel States. A very important day, and I'm sure there's going to be really great coverage and interesting activities happening across the world. So, continuing on the continent, Roger, you've been covering and talking about the situation in Congo. There seems to have been somewhat of a breakthrough. Can you give us a little context on what's happening there?
Yeah, a bit of progress. I wouldn't put it any further than cautiously optimistic, really, that kind of quaint old British way. But I think we've got some prospects for at least a movement towards some peace. I mean, those people watching this who've been negotiators in the past and who've been observers will know that one of the things that you kind of usually need to do to be able to get to the point of really tying down a peace agreement or tying down any sort of agreement is to create a framework on which you agree you will create that final deal. And that's what's happened in Congo. Now, it's really complicated, of course, and we've covered this in the past, by the fact that even though this particular framework agreement is between the Congolese government and the M23 militia, some people call them rebels. I don't think there's anything rebellious about them. They are a militia who've been fighting the government and who are backed by the third person in the marriage, if you like, which is the Rwandan government. Now, the Congolese government and the Rwandan government have reached their own kind of process, creating their own process to be able to make a deal, even though they're prepared to make a deal, the Rwandan government still says, well, it's nothing to do with us. We haven't been involved in all of this. And by the way, of course, we're not funding the M23 militia, when, of course, the whole world knows that they are. They're the only ones who just cannot bring themselves to say it. But this is really important, because if we can start to move this whole process towards some kind of peace process where a final agreement can be reached, then that's obviously good for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who've been affected by the fighting, either killed or been displaced and so on. Of course, one of the kind of issues that isn't getting talked about enough in all of this is the role of the United States in all of this, because, of course, one of the things that they really want to do is to get their hands on these really important minerals that keep the West going and boost the profits of the West, and that's what they're really interested in, and kind of is at the bottom of their involvement in these talks. So, whilst I think we can be really optimistic about the prospects for at least stopping the fighting and getting some peace for those people, or peace of some kind for those people on the ground who've had far too long of having to deal with all of this, then that's great news, but we're also run the danger of the US entrenching themselves in the region and having absolute control over these really important resources in Congo. So let's watch both of those things. Let's watch progress and be optimistic and hopeful for peace, but let's also just watch the United States and make sure that this isn't just another example of the United States going in and plundering the wealth from Africa and still forcing kids, forcing young people to dig into the ground and to extract these minerals at virtually nil expense, and then still the West profiting from that work. So lots to keep looking at, keep watching, give the people what they want, keep watching People's Dispatch, keep looking at Dispatch website, and keep reading the Morning Star for further information.
Yeah, I think, Roger, you pull out some really important points, and a lot of people were kind of shocked when they saw the possible involvement of Erik Prince, and I think rightfully so. People should definitely continue watching this with caution, but with optimism as well, because any end to the fighting, as we always say on the show, is a positive development. Again, I said we were going to start with some positive victories, more optimistic news today. And a really, really important development took place within Latin America, which is the repatriation of 252 Venezuelan nationals from the CCOT, essentially concentration camp in El Salvador of Nayib Bukele, back to Venezuela. And this battle has been going on essentially since March, when these Venezuelans were taken from detention centers without any notice and sent to El Salvador, where Nayib Bukele has been essentially paid to house these migrants in the worst and most violent, prison that exists in the country. And essentially from then, the families of these people, the government of Venezuela have been, attempting to raise hell in the United Nations, in protests all across, essentially trying to ring the alarm bells that this act is completely illegal, to take migrants who are detained for whatever reason, most of them just crossing the border, a lot of them because they had tattoos, and they, border agents said, okay, these people look dangerous, we're going to detain them, just for the act of being Venezuelan with tattoos. Then they're deported to another country where they have no recourse. During the time that they're in detention, they had no access to lawyers, no ability to speak to their family, essentially completely cut off from the outside world with no sense of when they would be released. And so this victory, it's just really, really important to highlight, because throughout this, it was really interesting to see that the Venezuelan opposition figures, Maria Corina Machado, these people were not raising hell about the fact that 252 of their brothers were put into a prison with no end in sight. They were released this week, on Friday, brought back to Venezuela, and really hailed as a major victory. They were released in a prisoner exchange, U.S. nationals that were released from Venezuela. And again, there's been a lot of news that's come out since their release about the detainees facing torture, facing sexual abuse, facing other forms of abuse while detained. And I think that we haven't seen the end of this story. And as we're seeing the Trump administration deporting more and more foreign nationals to third countries to be detained by these kind of comprador regimes, we're going to see a lot more of these struggles where maybe the home countries are fighting for their release. But this new development of, deporting migrants just for being migrants and keeping them in prison is very, very concerning. We carried a story in People's Dispatch about the deportation of people to Swaziland and how that's impacting there. This is not just a US or Latin America thing, but this is actually extending to the entire world. So it's important that we keep an eye on how this deportation policy is impacting the sovereignty of other countries, the human rights of their citizens, because truly it is this case. I think the treatment of the Venezuelan migrants is really kind of a forewarning of what could happen to other people. So we'll be following that more as, again, because there's an ongoing suit about the human rights violations, the torture allegations that took place in CCOT. There's definitely going to be more news on this. So we'll definitely be following that. As Roger said, keep watching People's Dispatch, keep following Morning Star. We're bringing you stories that, again, you aren't seeing elsewhere, with perspectives that you aren't seeing elsewhere. We're the ones who are able to talk to people in the movement who are on the ground organizing and have that perspective. So remember to support us, follow us, share it to your friends, your coworkers, because we only exist to share that with our audience, with people who support us and are engaged in that struggle. So with that, I'll hand it back to Prasanth. Climate crisis. I know we're all sweating in the summer, but what's the latest on this?
Oh, Roger's talking about that one.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, that's me to bring everybody down again, unfortunately. So I get the downer after that bit of good news. But so I think the time when politicians are going to be able to even pretend that there's no real climate crisis impacting on the global south is those days are coming to an end, really. I mean, it was always a bit dubious, well, more than a bit, but radically dubious for them to be able to even suggest that. What we've seen this week is a really important report, actually, from scientists, which says that the price of really key crops like cocoa, like cabbage, like potatoes are soaring through the roof. And of course, what that means for the global south, who are producing a lot of these crops, is that not only can't they sell them on, but there's nothing to sell on, because the way that the climate crisis is working is that the heat waves are actually meaning that people actually can't grow the crops. And of course, one of the ways of looking at this is that some people might think, well, all right, well, that's okay for a bit. Maybe they can grow them again if there's a little bit of rain. Doesn't work that way. One of the things about the climate is that if the ground is so dry, any water that comes down has to actually create a soil that crops can be grown in again. And so this is going to take a really considerable amount of time for people to be able to grow these crops again. So the crisis is hitting hard. Cocoa crops, something like 280% increase in the costs. Cabbage, 70% increase in costs. I think potatoes in India is something like 81% increase in costs. I mean, these are huge amounts, and this is something that's hitting the global south massively. What we saw in Europe yesterday as well, in Italy, was something very important as well in terms of the climate emergency. So Greenpeace were given the go-ahead to take one of the major energy companies in Italy, given the go-ahead to take a case against that company for the damage that they're causing to the environment. That's huge. That's massive, and something that should be really welcome. So there's a bit of an uptick in terms of good news there. And as we speak, we're waiting for the UN court to come through with a judgment about the responsibilities that nations have in terms of tackling the climate emergency. So we need to keep our fingers crossed for that something positive is going to come out of that. But of course, one of the problems that we see in recent times is that the international legal system means nothing to international capital, and they don't care about this. So if they don't care, then that means that people's movement around these issues becomes even more important. So we have to build the environmental movement so that we can actually put pressure on these nations, on these governments, to actually come up with the policies that are going to make sure that there's some mitigation against the climate emergency, but also to give people some reparation, if you like, for them to be able to continue to develop their nations, but also to enable them to deal with the worst effects of climate emergency. So what we're seeing is a real heavy impact. We're going to see over a period, we're going to see more and more where water is going to become an issue. Where water could really be a flashpoint between different countries, as we're seeing in some parts of Africa potentially now, with the building of a dam that's separating a number of northeast African countries. But we need to keep the pressure on and make sure that this doesn't turn into a battle between nations in the global south, but that the people in the global north who have caused these problems are made to pay for what they've done.
Yeah, it's definitely, as we continue to cover the climate crisis, and I think this year's COP30 is going to be of great importance. It's going to be held in Brazil, in the Amazon. There's a lot of expectations around what could happen. But again, as we've seen in the past, the COP is only able to do so much, but we'll definitely be following that in the next couple of months. Now, Prasanth, for real, Abahlali, baseMjondolo, we've covered it a lot, a grassroots shack dweller movement in South Africa on the front lines of a lot of big struggles. Some interesting news this past week. Bring us up to speed on that.
Right. Nicholas from People's Dispatch actually has a nice report. I would urge all of you to read that. And People's Dispatch earlier has covered in detail some of these issues as well that we're going to be talking about. But the news aspect of this is the fact that, thugs or hoodlums of this group called Operation Dudla actually attacked a rights organization in South Africa a few days ago. The rights organization's name is SEDI, that's Socioeconomic Rights Institute of South Africa. And it's been in the forefront of, working with a lot of disadvantaged sections, a lot of poorer sections in terms of studying them, in terms of working with them for their rights, in terms of legal action. And this issue specifically is about a crisis which, actually in some ways resonates or rhymes with some of the other crises we've been talking about, which is that the kind of policy framework of many countries over the past 20 or 30 years has led to a situation where the poorer sections in that country, the migrants, the minorities, women, etc., are all scapegoated. They are portrayed as the victims. And there is mob violence, vigilante violence against them. We talked about what's happening in the US. In South Africa, of course, thankfully, things are not that bad. We don't have the government actually doing that. But what we do have are vigilante groups which are doing exactly the same thing, which are basically going around. For instance, a recent instance was these groups basically trying to prevent people from accessing healthcare by saying that they were migrants or freeloaders, etc., etc. There have been instances in the past where they tried to evict businessmen from markets. They've been going around as wearing as paramilitary forces, claiming to be the police, claiming to be or the security forces. And one of the disturbing things about their actions has been that actually there seems to be in some level some kind of coordination. That's what activists are alleging, of coordination between them and the police forces. Because sometimes they do what are called their raids, and shortly after you have the police coming and doing exactly the same thing, claiming that they're illegal outsiders, etc., etc. So in 2023, SERI, Abahlali, baseMjondolo, and actually some other organizations together went to court, challenging or trying to bring accountability or demanding accountability from both Operation Dudla and the state for its failure to stop these kind of actions. And that case is still progressing, a very, very important case, something to track, because the organizations are clearly saying that this kind of rampant xenophobia can't go unchallenged. The state has to step in and play a positive role, not look away while its own police forces seem to be collaborating. So that seems to have been some recent developments around the case seem to have been the trigger for this violent march by Operation Dudla elements to SERI's office. And SERI did say that we will receive whatever petition you want to file, you want to have a discussion. Abahlali, baseMjondolo actually reached out to these elements and said that we want to have a discussion with you, tell us what your concerns are. But they refused and instead went there, indulged in violence, stone throwing, tear gas, etc., etc. And by that time, of course, organizations, civil society organizations, grassroots movements had gathered in defense of Siri. And, so there was a standoff over there. It turns out later that ABM activists who have been in solidarity with Siri are actually being threatened as well. So all in all, a very dangerous kind of situation, all the more dangerous because of lack of decisive action by the state to crack down on these elements. But I think also important in some senses to reflect on the material conditions which cause this kind of politics to emerge, the conditions of poverty, conditions of inequality, conditions, the destruction of social services, poor public spending, like Roger, you talked about climate change, for instance, all of these combining together in various ways, and the effort by political parties, either by omission or by commission, to pit these groups against each other, to pit the poorest against the poorest, so to speak, and and then try to sort of escape being accountable that way because they don't have to answer to the people if they are united. So worrying developments, but nonetheless heartening to see such powerful social mobilization by Abahlali and other groups. And I'm confident that they've declared themselves that they will continue to stand in solidarity with all those agencies and all those groups, all those organizations fighting against xenophobia.
Yeah, I think you bring to light a really important point, Prasanth, which is that these episodes of xenophobia and violence did not only take place in the global north, although we've seen extremely violent episodes of this, especially carried out by the state forces, but actually xenophobia is something that really does come with the crisis of capitalism, and that's no nation is spared. And Roger has covered this, of course, in some of the Gulf states and in many other kind of instances. So important to keep eyes on that. It is really a byproduct of capitalist exploitation, and as you said, the need to pit the poor against the poor. And bringing us to our last story, a message of hope, but also again this kind of situation of despair of what's happening in Gaza, where Israel, it feels like every couple of weeks we say that there's a possibility of a ceasefire and it seems close, and then Israel worsens its violence, intensifies its violence even more against the people of Gaza. And the situation which human rights organizations and the people in Palestine have been warning to, which is a famine, which is starvation, which is hunger, has actually really taken hold. And there's reports of over 100 people having died from starvation. The majority of those, notably, and important to note, are children. And so children, adults are dying of hunger. There's this manufactured starvation with, as everyone said, hundreds and hundreds of aid trucks full of food waiting just over the border. Israel is continuing to manufacture this crisis of hunger, of starvation, and at the same time intensifying its airstrikes, killing, continuing to shoot people at aid distribution sites, carrying out airstrikes at a kindergarten earlier this week. So these acts of brutality and violence are continuing to worsen. And in the face of this, again, we're seeing really positive and important intensified solidarity work. We covered a story of Belgian activists who are actually able to block an arms shipment to Israel. This has to happen everywhere, of course. But also another Freedom Flotilla is launching 2 days back after facing some setbacks, after facing what they think is acts of sabotage. The Handala is back on the water, headed to Gaza with aid, with really importantly, aid for children, with this really strong message of, the people will break the blockade. Israel cannot continue this illegal blockade. And there needs to be so much international attention, of course, of what's happening in Gaza, what's happening on this Freedom Flotilla. We know that the last Freedom Flotilla was, of course, intercepted by Israeli forces. Major attacks have taken place against these boats, but activists have said, we will keep going, we will keep trying, because we can't stay silent and we can't, be inactive in the face of this genocide, this starvation, and all of the rest. So really encouraging message that these people are back on the waters, headed to Gaza. Mobilizations continue across the globe, rejecting this policy of starvation, of genocide. Importantly, a letter signed by 28 countries, including Israel's top allies, who have been literally aiding and abetting their policy of war. Notably, the United Kingdom and other European countries have signed on to this, saying, no more. This cannot continue. So we'll see. We'll see if actually there's advance in the ceasefire talks. There's any chance of actually putting enough pressure on not only Israel, but of course the United States to stop this genocide once and for all. We'll keep our eyes on the Handala. We'll keep our eyes on the Freedom Flotilla. And hopefully next week we'll come back with better news. So thanks everyone for tuning in once again. This is Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch with Morningstar News. We're happy to see you every week. Follow us, and we'll see you next week.